Greetings, everyone, and welcome to THE507, Lecture 9b, where we look at Paul's epistle to the Romans. Paul's epistle to the Romans has been held up for centuries as his theological masterpiece, as a summary of his thinking on all major topics. But the past 50 years of scholarship on Paul has very much called this into question. Indeed, already over 100 years ago, scholars noted that topics such as the righteousness of God coming from faith is actually not something Paul talks about much at all outside of Romans and Galatians. So, whereas the Protestant Reformation, because of its interest in this doctrine, tended to see Romans as the beating heart of Pauline theology, it's actually possible that we have a somewhat skewed interest in this theme. What's more than that is that this is not the only thing that Paul talks about in Romans. And by all accounts, one of the challenges of making sense of Paul's epistle to the Romans is this. He talks about a lot of different topics, and I'm going to say a brief word about these different chapters, these different sections. Not only does he talk about a lot of different topics, but every other letter we have from Paul is what we would call an occasional letter. That is, it is written in response to some occasion, some concrete events, questions from the church at Corinth, a crisis in Galatia, some confusion from the Thessalonians, a letter to foster and maintain friendship, a hey, how are you doing, to the Philippians. Romans, in at least two ways, sits a little odd with this pattern of Paul writing occasional letters. The biggest is that he hasn't been to this church. Every other letter we have is to someone he knows, to a church he founded. And in fact, Paul makes a really big deal, both in Romans but elsewhere, about saying you don't meddle in other people's churches. You don't build on other folks' foundations. So why is he writing to a church he's never been to? And why is he writing them this much if he's never been there? Relatedly, what do these different sections have to do with each other? So I've given a fairly conventional summary to chapters 1 to 4, 5 to 8, 9 to 11, and so on. But you can see, and I'll just go through these briskly, that these sure look like they're almost unrelated. So, writing to a church he's never been to, he says, folks, righteousness of God is from faith to faith. Okay, this could be his statement of the heart of his gospel. That's in fact how he presents it. And here I can say nothing more than I just encourage you as you read, ask yourself this question. And I don't have an answer, and no one has a really good answer to this question. Paul says that what is revealed in the gospel is God's righteousness. Well, the dikaiosune theou is the Greek, the righteousness of God. If you were to retell Paul's gospel story, all humanity seems to fall short of the glory of God or of the goodness of God, but God sent Christ as a propitiatory sacrifice. This is Romans 3, 24, 25. Though we were sinners, yet God still loved us, Romans 5. How would you sum up that basic story? Humans being sinful, weak, bad, out of fellowship with God, and God, from God's side, taking the initiative to do something about that and reconcile sinners to himself by the death of his Son. I think most of us would say, in this gospel message, we see the mercy of God, or the love of God, right? I think both those words seem like the obvious choice of words, compared with the justice of God, or the righteousness of God. Either justice or righteousness could translate the Greek dikaiosune. And yet, Paul throughout this letter keeps saying, in this gospel story, what we mainly see revealed is God's justice. That's weird. That should make you scratch your head and say, what definition of justice are you using, Paul? That a story about God not giving people what they really deserve, what they deserve is wrath, God instead reaching out to them in love and sacrificing his son to reestablish harmony, why do you sum up that story? Ah, that looks like justice. That's God's justice. I'm going to leave that question lingering. That's a hard question to answer, and people have had a lot of goes at it. Okay, the first 4 chapters, Paul seems to say everyone gets it wrong, both Jews and Greeks, but God did something on our behalf. Romans 5 to 8. I think we could sum up, there's a lot that goes on here, but he could say, here's what the life of this righteousness looks like. If 1 to 4 kind of does the theological heavy lifting, the metaphysical heavy lifting, Romans 5 to 8 says, this new righteousness gets lived out. You're no longer a slave to unrighteousness, you're now a slave to righteousness. Romans 7 addresses the thorny problem, does Paul's gospel undermine the law? And this is a major concern throughout all of Romans, as Paul's trying to show that his gospel does not contradict the Jewish law, God's promises to Israel, the prerogative of the Jews, that his gospel is fully consistent with those givens. And if you wanted a really shorthand way to sum up 5 to 8, I would sum it up like this. Paul says, my gospel does not promote lousy behavior. To the contrary, even though God did this kind of strange thing while we were still sinners, God mercifully reconciled us. That, in my theology, Paul would say, does not lead to license to do whatever we like. Oh, to the contrary. We've simply exchanged one form of slavery, slavery to sin, to a new slavery, slavery to righteousness. And we are now freed to do what is right. Then he turns in 9 to 11 to talk about Israel. Have the promises of God failed? Here again, it's hard to summarize 9 to 11 because Paul, on a first reading and sometimes on a 15th reading, it looks like Paul gives 3 different solutions to the same basic problem. The basic problem is easy. Paul sees that the gospel is having more success among Gentiles than it has among his own kinsmen, the Jews, his brethren according to the flesh, as he calls them. I'll say a bit more about these chapters, but let me simply say here, it's really important to note that Paul insists on the prerogatives of Israel. He says, everything God promised is irrevocable. Those promises cannot be taken away. They must succeed. And Paul says, he's so torn up inside about the state of his kinsmen, their state of unbelief, that he says, I might pray that I could be accursed on their behalf. I wish I could be cut off. This is just how Moses prays in the book of Exodus, where Moses says to God, if you're not going to go with the people, please just take my life, but don't abandon the people. It's just really important to say that Paul is not a supersessionist. That's a term for the Christian theological outlook that God was fed up with Israel and had moved on to new and better things, the Gentiles, spiritual truths. Paul has harsh things to say about unbelievers, but the whole tone of 9 to 11 is Paul's heartfelt concern that what God promised to Israel must come to fruition. Now, that said, how does he explain theologically this confusing situation? Have the promises failed? Has the word of God failed? That's his question in 9 verse 5. Well, you need to take my unit on the book of Romans, where we actually spend multiple hours on this section to fully explore this. But suffice it to say, chapter 9 seems to mainly say, no, the promises haven't failed because promises to Israel, put this in scare quotes, Israel, what does that really mean? God has often picked an Israel within Israel. God can sovereignly elect whomever God will. God loved Jacob and hated Esau before they were even born. So maybe the promises only apply to a secret elect, not to all people who think they're Israel, but only to a subset. Okay, you can decide if you find that theologically palatable, but it does make the problem go away. If the problem is, have God's promises failed? The answer would be no. We just misunderstood them. We thought they were to everyone. They weren't. They were only to a secret subset of elect. But Paul himself doesn't really seem satisfied with that line of argument. So in chapter 10, we get a line of argument which actually I don't know what Paul's talking about in chapter 10. You can have a look. There's a lot of quotations, and have a look at the commentaries. A recent commentary by an author, Leander Keck, who spent 25 years working on the commentary. The quotations from his commentary in Romans chapter 10 say, a bit confusing, again, not quite clear, indistinct arguments, mystifying use of scripture, and I could go on and on. So, to try to be positive here, Paul says something in Romans 10 kind of like God has been reaching out to Israel. God hasn't given up. Kind of Israel is to blame, but kind of, I don't know, God has sent messengers or something. Okay, Romans 11. Paul has a sort of third bite at the cherry. Romans 11 quite strikingly insists that Gentile believers, so far from being a fresh invention, are grafted in to the one and only olive tree, the olive tree of Israel. That is the sort of sap, the nourishment coming into Gentile believers. Paul says this to the Gentiles in Rome. Folks, your nourishment, your Holy Spirit, all this stuff comes from the roots of Abraham. There's only one tree. The tree wasn't cut down and replaced. You were grafted in to the tree. Now that's about as clear an opposition to supersessionism as you could have. Paul then concludes in Romans 11:26, thus all Israel will be saved. And unfortunately, it's not clear, although he spent 3 chapters trying to address this question, it's actually not clear what he means. Does he mean every Jew will be saved? Does he mean every Jew by his redefinition of Jew? Anyway, again, we don't have time to look at all those arguments, but we can restate Paul's sentiment. It's clear in Romans 9 to 11, he's deeply concerned about this apparent theological problem. What about Israel? And it's clear he thinks God must save all Israel because that's what God promised to do. That much is clear. In between, there's a lot of confusion. I just note, to step back to the overall outline, can you see what's confusing here? Now Paul's writing to a church in Rome that he's never been to, and he's telling them about a topic he never really goes into in any other letters. Why? Why write to Rome about the problem of Israel in such depth? Furthermore, he's writing to the Gentiles in Rome. He explicitly says, there are Jews and Gentiles among the believers in Rome. The Christian communities in Rome include Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. But Paul views his apostolic ministry only to Gentiles. And he addresses his letter, Romans 1, verse 5, Romans 16. I am writing to you Gentiles in Rome. Why is he telling them all this? Interesting question. How does Romans 9 to 11 fit into the flow of Romans? Interesting question. Paul then, as it were, cracks his knuckles and clears his throat and addresses yet what appears to be an entirely distinct topic again. Romans 12 to 15, where he takes up Christian ethics, first in a very kind of a proverbial way, full of generalisms. May the giver be generous. May the sharer be good at sharing. May the teacher do some teaching. May the one who is zealous be zealous in the spirit. Now, after he gets done rattling off those sorts of generalities, he gets very specific. And in Romans 13, instructs believers to submit to the Roman government because it is God's servant for good. And Romans 13 has an interesting history because this passage where Paul holds up the Roman government as the tool of God. It's simply God's right hand executing God's will on earth. This has been used, to defend some of the worst governments in human history, and it's been used in sermons to tell Christians, you mustn't resist the government, or else you're resisting God. Why does Paul say such glowing things about the Roman government? Bear in mind, the Roman government had just executed the Son of God in Palestine 15 years earlier. And the Roman government was going to execute Paul in Rome in the not too distant future. Again, we can't look into that more, but Paul then does talk about Christian ethics in a way that would clearly be germane to Rome, and that is, he speaks about unity in diversity and the importance of all Christians, even of different theological outlooks, being unified. That's a big deal to Paul. From this, we turn to Romans 15:14 to the end, and we get quite a lot about Paul's travel plans. And that's what I want to spend the rest of the time looking at. That is Paul's plans to take a collection of the Gentiles to Judea and then to go on to Spain. And in chapter 16, we get the most extensive meet and greet of any of Paul's letters. There's a really long list, so 20-some names of so-and-so says hi to so-and-so. Oh, by the way, please greet so-and-so. Again, we can't get into all these questions, but before we look at Paul's travel plans and Paul's collection for the Gentiles and what that says about his understanding of his mission, before we look at that, I've noted that these different segments appear to be somewhat different. Theological points about the righteousness of God being from faith to faith. The life of this new righteousness. What about Israel? Christian ethics and Paul's plans. What ties this all together, if anything? And to return to our initial question, is this a summary of Paul's theology, or is it, as we should expect, an occasional letter, a letter written with immediate purposes and circumstances on Paul's mind? I'll answer both questions at once, with admitting that these are provisional answers. To the second question, I answer both and. It is an occasional letter, like all of Paul's others, and it is a summary, in many ways, of his theology. Why? Because it's written in a strange occasion, or for a strange occasion. And this we will explore more as we look at where Paul is headed when he writes Romans. But to just sketch it out, Paul is about to go to Jerusalem with this worldwide collection of Gentile money, and he knows the Christian leaders in Jerusalem may very likely say, no thanks, we don't want your stinking money. Why would they say that? Because there's a lot of people with a lot of bad views about Paul. And here's where I think we can tie this together, tie these different sections together. What are the main bad views about Paul? That his gospel undermines the Old Testament, undermines the promises to Israel, undermines the goodness of God's law, undermines the basis for any sort of decent ethics by saying, you're free, Christ set you free. Now we go back through and we say, my gospel is about righteousness. The life of this new righteousness, what God did was gave us a power to live rightly. He didn't give us carte blanche to do what we wanted. My gospel is, I am deeply concerned about Israel, and my gospel by no means undermines the prerogatives of Israel. Let me say more about what Christian ethics look like in my Christian understanding. And finally, let me make the point in my actual actions of how deeply I care about Israel. I'm on my way to Palestine, even though I want to get to Spain, to the ends of the earth. I'm on my way to Palestine because I believe this worldwide movement must embody the truth that the gospel is for the Jew first and then for the Greek. And that means my Greek churches, my Gentile churches, have to send money to Palestine, to Jerusalem. That would be a red thread running through all these disparate sections, and it would explain why Paul writes on such a long letter. He's defending himself. He's explaining himself. He's almost giving a dress rehearsal of what he's going to say when he gets to Jerusalem, and the critics stand up. And he's introducing himself to the Romans because he wants their support in his mission. And so he wants to introduce himself to them and say, hey guys, you may have heard some funny things about me. Not the case. And by the way, will you please support me in my upcoming mission to Spain? So much for a breakneck survey of all of Romans in 20 minutes. The next lecture looks a little more closely at this collection, because this is something that Paul speaks about in every authentic letter. It's a bigger deal than people have realized, and it gives us a chance to think about Paul's activity, not only his theology.